o'clock where I'm at. Good to be with y'all again. I appreciate so much the opportunity to speak with you. It means a lot. I appreciate that. I hope you guys are doing well. Hope to be with you more in the future. We had a good service here this morning at Parkway. I trust you guys had a good morning service there. But we'll get right into the lesson. If you don't have your Bible open, if you would open it to 1 Samuel 17. One of I have I don't know, I guess all preachers do. They have a handful of subjects that they just love to talk about. David is mine. David is probably my although Peter is a close second, David is probably my favorite Bible character, hands down. Besides Jesus, of course. I learned so much from his story. Of course, if you're in 1 Samuel 17, that's not where his story really starts. His story really starts in 1 Samuel 16. Samuel has gone to Jesse's house. God's told him to go down there, and that's where he will appoint the new king of Israel. And of course, we love, Samuel's going down the line of Jesse's children and looking at all of David's brothers. And at first he thinks, well, surely this one will be it. He looks at Eliab in verse 6, and, he says, surely that this is him. In verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And how David has just a heart for God. He's described as a man after God's own heart. And I love the account here in 1 Samuel 17 of David and Goliath. And you can kind of take this story and go several ways with it. But to me, it's just so interesting how, chapter 17, you have the armies of Israel on one side of this valley. You have the Philistine army on the other. And this giant Philistine comes out. It was culture of the day, so to speak, to have kind of one-on-one combat to save the army of all the death and the bloodshed. So, hey, you send out one person and we send out one person, and then let them fight. And if our side wins, well, that's great. If your side wins, well, it is what it is. And so Philistines, verse 3 says, the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, and Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. There's some debate about how large that is. Is it 9 feet? Is it 10 feet? Is it 12 feet? To me, he's just a giant. He is far, far larger than any of the average man there. And talks about verse 5, what he looks like, and his helmet, and what he's armed with, and his armor, and his javelin. He has his staff, his spear, and it was weaver's beam, and the shield bearer goes before him. And he goes out there. If you can just picture this, he goes out there and he stands and he just cries out, just shouts to the armies of Israel. And he says, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Can you imagine that? You're in the army, and that big giant, that champion who has been a champion from birth, will find out. It means he's been bred for this. All he knows is fighting. All he knows is battle. All he knows is winning. And he comes out, he shouts this to the armies of Israel, and nobody does anything. What amazed me so much is Saul, who Saul is hands down their best warrior. If you know Saul's history, he's actually quite a tall man himself, not giant stature per se, but he's head and shoulders above everybody else. He's a sight. He is a warrior. But Saul is different. Saul is different now. The Spirit of God, which it's not our lesson tonight, but has left Saul. It's departed from Saul because Saul was disobedient to God, and therefore Saul is even afraid. But then David, David shows up. David, and there's so many similarities between David and Jesus. I mean, the comparison between David and Jesus is just so amazing. It's a wonderful, wonderful study, and just to go and just figure, look at all the similarities. To me, it's so interesting. We won't talk about all of them. We'll talk about a couple. But David, he's sent down there where the army is. He's not sent to fight. He's sent to go check on his brothers. He's sent by his father, and Jesus, was sent by his father, sent to us. And he gets there, and David hears this giant shouting these evil, these hateful words defying God. All this, if you're into sports, all this trash talk, so to speak. And David gets there, and he doesn't understand why nobody's not doing anything. And David's own brothers come up to him and they're like, why are you here? Why are you're here just to cause trouble? And his brothers reject him, so to speak. You can see that in the life of Jesus. How he's sent to this earth, and even his own brothers, they reject him. And David says, verse 29, he's what have I done? His brothers are fussing at him. He says, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And Saul hears these words. And in verse 32, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, this giant. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. And of course, Saul says to David, he says, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're a youth. And this man, he's a man of war from his youth. David doesn't look the part of the warrior. You look at that in the life of Jesus. The Jewish culture had the idea, especially, that Jesus was going to come back and be this almighty warrior and move them from the rule of Rome and set up an earthly kingdom, so to speak. But Jesus appears and looks nothing like that, acts nothing like that. And then David shows up, and he's not a warrior. He's just a young guy, but he sees a cause. And Saul says, you can't go fight this guy. You're a young man. You're a youth. But David relies on some experiences where God has been there in his life. In verse 34, he says, but your servant used to keep his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came, took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. And your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has divided the armies of the living God. Verse 37, which is to me just so powerful. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, the Lord be with you. I think we don't know much more about that battle between a lion and a bear, but you can go online, you can go on YouTube now and see lions fighting each other or fighting other animals. You can see bears, large like grizzly bears. And just imagine a human being fighting one of those animals. It's just, to me, just so powerful. He convinces Saul that he can do this. And Saul says, fine, go. And of course, they try to clothe him with the armor of Saul's armor, and it doesn't fit. And there's some lessons there, for us. But, David says, I can't go in this. I'm not tested it, and David's not a warrior here. He's a shepherd. So he takes the staff. He takes verse 4. He takes the staff and his 5 smooth stones, and he goes out there. He draws near the Philistine, and he goes out there and he conquers the Philistine, and he slaughters this Philistine. And what I want to see here is in verse 50 for us, for kind of the bulk of the rest of our lesson. Verse 50 talks about, it says, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him. and cut off his head with it. And there's two. I'm just try to keep it as simple as I can. There's only 2 points I'm going to make this afternoon, this evening for you. And one of them is that David uses Goliath's own sword. Why does he use Goliath's own sword? I mean, for one thing, David doesn't have one. We just mentioned there about verse 38, verse 40-ish. Saul tells him to go, and Saul tries to put his armor on David. It doesn't fit, and he gives David his sword. And David says, I can't go. I'm not tested this. He refuses Saul's sword. But I think it's another lesson for us. But he takes what he knows. He takes his staff, takes a handful of smooth stones. He takes the shepherd's pouch, takes the sling that he's so good at. But you can also go online and watch videos of people who have a sling like they had in those days, and how powerful that is. It's just amazing what they can do with that. But David doesn't have a sword, which I thought is very interesting. Why does he use Goliath? Verse, 50 tells us that he didn't have one. Verse 38 talks about that he didn't take one with him. But I thought it was very interesting that this is what Goliath was going to use to kill David. And David has now used it to kill him. And I know in verse 50, and maybe there's some confusion, I'm not sure what's accurate or not. Verse 50 says that David struck him with the stone and killed him. And now in verse 51, there it says that David takes his sword and kills him. Which is it? Did he double kill him? It says the stone struck him and killed him. Some say, well, the stone just knocked him out, or the stone was just, he was incapacitated. He was for the most part, he was already dead. I don't know if I know the correct answer to that, but here's what I do know. When David takes Goliath's own sword and cuts his head off, he is most certainly dead. So one of the questions is, well, if the stone did kill him, why go the extra mile and cut his head off? Why do that? And I'll say for one reason, it's because that's what David said he was going to do. Look at our base text, verse 45. And I love this passage so much. I can't never not do a lesson about David and just not read these couple of verses here. To me, it's so powerful. It says, then David said to Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, that all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, but for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Let me tell you, there's so many passages that I would love to hear them being said in that time. If I could just been a fly on the wall there, so to speak, to hear. And of course, I mean, everything that Jesus says you would want to hear, obviously. But let me tell you, right next to that, I would love to know, to been there and to hear the way David talked to this Goliath, the faith that David has. I get the faith that there's no stuttering. He has courage from the get-go, that he knows that God delivered him from the lion, from the bear, then God's going to deliver him from this giant. He knows it. And his speech reflects that. His speech reflects his faith and his courage. And I think it's very interesting that David tells Goliath that, hey, this battle is not just between you and me. You said for one guy to come out here and fight, and if you win, there will be your servants, but if I win, you'll be our servants. He said, that's not what this is going to work. He said, not only am I going to kill you, but all of your camp is going to suffer. They're not going to be our servants. To me, I thought that was just so amazing. But so why is it a big deal that he used Goliath's own sword against him? We mentioned earlier about seeing seeing Jesus in this story of David and Goliath, how we can see him so many places. And do you see Jesus here? And of course, we all see Jesus as David. Now we do this story a lot of times. You can look at it in so many different ways, which I find so amazing. You look at it, that we need to be like David. We need to have the courage and the faith that he has, and that, to me, that's so amazing. The faith to tackle our giants, because we all have them, and we're all going through them. But the truth is, the ultimate story here, the ultimate comparison, is that Jesus is our David. And what is Goliath? Goliath is Satan. Goliath is sin. Goliath is death. And what does Romans 6:23 say? The wages of sin are what? Are death. Since the very beginning, when Adam and Eve sinned, the result of that sin was death. And Satan held power over that. He held power over death because of their sin. But until Jesus came. When Jesus came, that changed everything. Jesus defeated Satan in the wilderness, but he defeated Satan on that cross. When Jesus went to the cross, he faced his biggest giant. He faced Satan. He faced sin, our sin. He faced death, and he overcame it. And just like David takes Goliath's sword and he uses it against him, Jesus has now taken death away from Satan. In 1 Corinthians 15, starting verse 50, it says, I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. We shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. The trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. And the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality. Then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. What's Paul saying? That our victory over death, we can have victory in death. Death is swallowed up in victory. Death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? We can have victory over death because of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ gives us the victory over Satan, over sin, and over death when he went to that cross for us. Jesus slayed the giant because we couldn't do it by ourselves. David shows up and he slays this giant. Why? Because nobody else there could do it. Nobody else had the courage to do it. Nobody else could. David was the only one. Because why? Because David knew that despite that David, just because David's going out there on the battlefield, that the battle's not David's. He said, the battle's the Lord's. The Lord will deliver me. The Lord will provide. The Lord will do this. Because of the cross, the death, the burial, the resurrection, because of our baptism, being washed with the blood, being immersed into his death, his burial, and one day our resurrection, we have victory over Satan. We have victory over Satan. We have victory over sin. We have victory over death. Isn't that wonderful? And it's easy to say that. It's easy for us to get kind of overconfident. And that's not, the devil is still there. The devil still has some powers. And we're not quite sure we understand all what he has, but we know he has powers. And, Peter talks about, 1 Peter 5:8, about he's walking about like a roaring lion, seeking what? Whom he may devour. And in Ephesians 6, Paul talks about, hey, you got to put on the whole armor of God because the devil is out there, the ruler the prince of darkness, the rule. He's all these. It's so scary to think about things that he's in charge of. Make no mistake that we are in a battle against Satan, but because of Jesus, we can have victory if we're only like David. We know that the battle is not ours, because on ourselves we cannot win. David was a mighty warrior that day, but David didn't kill Goliath. It was God, because David had faith that the battle was God's. Our battle is with Satan. And if we want to tackle Satan one-on-one, we will lose every time. But when we tackle him with Jesus, we win every single time. The hard part is making sure we're fighting him with Jesus. And that's probably another lesson for us. But also, I like verse 51 here. So verse 51 says, Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. So the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharhim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his armor in his tent. What did the rest of this is our second point. What did the rest of the men do before David slayed the giant? Verse 24 says, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, when they saw Goliath, what did all of them do? They fled from him and were much afraid. We look at this story a lot, and we put Jesus as David, which is rightly so, and Goliath is Satan. It's sin. It's death. It's an obstacle that we have to tackle. Sometimes we put ourselves as David, but we're looking at it from the whole context of what the story really is. Where are you and I in this story? We're in verse 24. That's where we would have been. We all want to say, I want to be more like David. We should be David. But that's us in verse 24. That's me. Seeing Goliath, knowing that there's nothing I can do about it, being scared and fleeing. That's me. What's so interesting here is that look at what happens after he slays the giant. Verse 52, it says, And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines. Some say that, maybe you read some into it, and some say that maybe David was even leading them. He was leading the charge. I've tried doing research to see exactly how far they had to go and things like that. And, some say that they pursued him over 100 miles. They pursued the Philistines over 100 miles. What is the difference? It says verse 52, they rose with a shout and pursued. What's the difference? It's the exact same men in verse 24 and verse 52. What is it? Why, in one instance, are they afraid? The next minute, they're following after, they're chasing the Philistines. What is it? The difference was that their king had finally shown up. Their king had come, and they were following their king. It's so amazing the way that God chooses to introduce David to his kingdom as the king. This is what your king's going to be. He slaughters Goliath, the champion, the one that nobody can be, the one that nobody can take on. Can you imagine how they felt having David on their side? It's not just like David barely beat Goliath and he just barely scraped by and defeated him. Let me tell you, when I read the battle of David and Goliath, there was no battle. None whatsoever. It was all one-sided. It was all David. It was all the Lord's, really, but it was all David. So this is the last point. Do you see yourself in this story? I think we all agree. We all see ourselves in verse 24. But let me tell you, can you see yourself in verse 52? Can you see yourself with a shout, pursuing, following your king? You know, if we believe that Jesus took on our Goliath, he took on Satan, he took on sin, he took on death, he overcame. And death does not have to be something that we dread. I know we do, and I understand that. This coming up Wednesday will be 3 years since the passing of my mom. Everybody mourns differently, and it's different for everybody. Yeah, there's sometimes when it's hard, and there's sometimes it's not as hard. Let me tell you, because of because of Jesus's victory at the cross over Satan, over death, over sin. Oh man, we have that hope of seeing each other again. We have that hope of eternity in heaven, in a place that John describes that's perfect. There's no crying, there's no pain, there's no suffering, there is no more death. Isn't that wonderful? So my last question is, do we live like it? If I'm in verse 24, that means I'm also in verse 52. Am I living like that with a shout? Do I do I speak boldly about my Lord? Do I let people see my light shine that Jesus said? He says, what? You're the light, a city on a hill. You don't hide your light in your basket. You let people see it so your Heavenly Father can be glorified. Do I live that way? Or am I stuck in verse 24, still being afraid? Let me tell you, if Jesus took on death, took on Satan, took on the cross, took on evil, took on sin, oh man, I should live like it. And I've been washed in his blood. I've been baptized into his death, his burial, his resurrection. One day I'll be resurrected, live forever in eternity. Oh man. If I want to live like that there, I need to live like that here. I need to live like that, like these people in verse 52, with a shout, pursuing, following my king. Am I following my king my daily life? Do I live with this fear of dread? Do I live with, and let me make sure I'm careful. I understand we all have pain, we all have sufferings, we all have problems, and your problem is your problem, and God knows it, and God cares about your problems, how big or how small. And I love reading Matthew 6 about Jesus talking about how don't be worrying about tomorrow. Don't be anxious. Why are you? He doesn't want us to. He knows that we will be, but he doesn't want us to. It's so powerful when Peter, my other favorite passages, when Peter walks on the water. They see Jesus walking to him, and Peter calls out, if it's you, Lord, you call me out there and I'll walk to you. And Jesus says, come. Peter gets out. He's walking towards Jesus. But then he notices the wind, the waves. And Jesus will take away the wind and the waves all the time. He allows them to be there sometimes. And that's his decision, his alone. But Peter notices the wind and the waves, begins to sink. What does he do? When he sinks, he cries out, reaches out for Jesus. And what does Jesus do? He reaches out back. He's there waiting to pick us back up. Something that's so powerful in that story that I've never seen till recently, but says they both go back to the boat. I'm curious how they do that. Does Jesus pick Peter up like the lamb talk about in Luke 15, like the shepherd does, the one lost lamb? Or do they both just walk back on the water to the boat? I think they both walk back to the water on the boat. And you know what? The wind and the waves were still there. It says when Jesus got in the boat, when he got in the boat, when they got in the boat, that's when Jesus calmed the waters. But you know, as long as we have Jesus, only put our faith, our hope, and our trust in Jesus, despite whatever winds or waves or storms come to pass, despite whatever giants we have in our future, as long as we have Jesus, he allows us to walk on the water. He keeps us from stumbling. If we have Jesus, we can be like these men, verse 52. We can rise with a shout. We can pursue, we can follow our King. Isn't that amazing? That's your lesson this evening. Thank you.